Part 13 of Volume 3 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by PlutarchPerrin. Marcus Licinius Crassus, Part 2. Crassus was now in fear lest some impulse to march upon Rome should seize Spartacus, but took heart when he saw that many of the gladiators' men had seceded after a quarrel with him and were encamped by themselves on a Lucanian lake. This lake, they say, changes from time to time in the character of its water, becoming sweet and then again bitter and undrinkable. Upon this detachment Crassus fell, and drove them away from the lake, but he was robbed of the slaughter in pursuit of the fugitives by the sudden appearance of Spartacus, who checked their flight. Before this, Crassus had written to the Senate that they must summon Lucullus from Thrace and Pompey from Spain, but he was sorry now that he had done so, and was eager to bring the war to an end before those generals came. He knew that the success would be ascribed to the one who came up with assistance and not to himself. Accordingly, in the first place, he determined to attack those of the enemy who had seceded from the rest and were encamping on their own account. They were commanded by Gaius Canicius and Castus, and with this in view sent out 6,000 men to preoccupy a certain eminence, bidding them keep their attempt a secret. And they did try to elude observation by covering up their helmets, but they were seen by 2 women who were sacrificing for the enemy, and would have been in peril of their lives had not Crassus quickly made his appearance and given battle, the most stubbornly contested of all. For although he slew 12,300 men in it, he found only 2 were wounded in the back. The rest all died standing in the ranks and fighting the Romans. After the defeat of this detachment, Spartacus retired to the mountains of Petelia, followed closely by Quintus, one of the officers of Crassus, and by Scophus the quaestor, who hung upon the enemy's rear. But when Spartacus faced about, there was a great rout of the Romans, and they barely managed to drag the quaestor who had been wounded away into safety. This success was the ruin of Spartacus, for it filled his slaves with overconfidence. They would no longer consent to avoid battle, and would not even obey their leaders, but surrounded them as soon as they began to march, with arms in their hands, and forced them to lead back through Lucania against the Romans, the very thing which Crassus also most desired. For Pompey's approach was already announced, and there were not a few who publicly proclaimed that the victory in this war belonged to him. He had only to come and fight and put the end to the war. Crassus, therefore, pressed on to finish the struggle himself, and having encamped near the enemy, began to dig a trench. Into this the slaves leapt and began to fight with those who were working there, and since fresh men from both sides kept coming up to help their comrades, Spartacus saw the necessity that was upon him, and drew up his whole army in order of battle. In the first place, when his horse was brought to him, he drew his sword, and saying that if he won the day, he would have many fine horses of the enemy's, but if he lost it, he did not want any, he slew his horse. Then, pushing his way toward Crassus himself, through many flying weapons and wounded men, he did not indeed reach him, but slew 2 centurions who fell upon him together. Finally, after his companions had taken to flight, he stood alone, surrounded by a multitude of foes, and was still defending himself when he was cut down. But although Crassus had been fortunate, had shown most excellent generalship, and had exposed his person to danger, nevertheless his success did not fail to enhance the reputation of Pompey. For the fugitives from the battle encountered that general and were cut to pieces, so that he could write to the Senate that in open battle, indeed, Crassus had conquered the slaves, but that he himself had extirpated the war. Pompey, accordingly, for his victories over Sertorius and in Spain, celebrated a splendid triumph, but Crassus, for all his self-approval, did not venture to ask for the major triumph, and it was thought ignoble and mean for him to celebrate even the minor triumph on foot, called the Ovation, for a servile war. How the minor triumph differs from the major, and why it is named as it is, has been told in my Life of Marcellus. After this, Pompey was at once asked to stand for the consulship, and Crassus, although he had hopes of becoming his colleague, did not hesitate to ask Pompey's assistance. Pompey received his request gladly, for he was desirous of having Crassus, in some way or other, always in debt to him for some favor, and eagerly promoted his candidature, and finally said in a speech to the assembly that he should be no less grateful to them for the colleague than for the office which he desired. However, when once they had assumed office, they did not remain on this friendly basis, but differed on almost every measure, quarreled with one another about everything, and by their contentiousness rendered their consulship barren politically and without achievement, except that Crassus made a great sacrifice in honor of Hercules, feasted the people at 10,000 tables, and made them an allowance of grain for 3 months. And when at last their term of office was closing, and they were addressing the assembly, a certain man, not a noble, but a Roman knight, rustic and rude in his way of life, Onatius Aurelius, mounted the rostra and recounted to the audience a vision which had come to him in his sleep. "Jupiter," he said, "appeared to me, and bade me declare in public that you should not suffer your consuls to lay down their office until they become friends." When the man said this and the people urged a reconciliation, Pompey, for his part, stood motionless, but Crassus took the initiative and clasped him by the hand and said, "Fellow citizens, I think there is nothing humiliating or unworthy in my taking the first steps towards goodwill and friendship with Pompey, to whom you have gave the title of great, before he has grown a beard, and voted him a triumph before he was a senator." Such, then, were the memorable things in the consulship of Crassus, but his censorship passed without any results or achievements whatever. He neither made a revision of the Senate, nor a scrutiny of the knights, nor a census of the people, although he had Lutatius Catulus, the gentlest of the Romans, for his colleague. But they say that when Crassus embarked upon the dangerous and violent policy of making Egypt tributary to Rome, Catulus opposed him vigorously, whereupon, being at variance, both voluntarily laid down their office. In the affair of Catiline, which was very serious and almost subversive of Rome, some suspicion attached itself to Crassus, and a man publicly named him as one of the conspirators, but nobody believed him. Nevertheless, Cicero, in one of his orations, plainly inculpated Crassus and Caesar. This oration, it is true, was not published until after both were dead, but in the treatise upon his consulship, Cicero says that Crassus came to him by night with a letter which gave details of the affair of Catiline, and felt that he was at last establishing the fact of a conspiracy. And Crassus, accordingly, always hated Cicero for this, but was kept from doing him any open injury by his son. For Publius Crassus, given to literature and learning, was attached to Cicero, so much so that he put on mourning when Cicero did at the time of his trial, and prevailed upon the other young men to do the same. And finally he persuaded his father to become Cicero's friend. And now, when Caesar came back from his province, and prepared to seek the consulship, he saw that Pompey and Crassus were once more at odds with each other. He therefore did not wish to make one of them an enemy by asking the aid of the other, nor did he have any hope of success if neither of them helped him. Accordingly he tried to reconcile them by persistently showing them that their mutual ruin would only increase the power of such men as Cicero, Catullus, and Cato, men whose influence would be nothing if Crassus and Pompey would only unite their friends and adherents, and with one might and purpose direct the affairs of the city. He persuaded them, reconciled them, and won them both to his support, and constituted the triumvirate an irresistible power, with which he overthrew the Senate and the people, not by making his partners greater, the one through the other, but by making himself greatest of all through them. For owing to the support of both, he was at once triumphantly elected consul, and during his consulship they voted him armies to command, and put Gaul into his hands, and so, as it were, established him in an Acropolis, thinking to share the rest with one another at their leisure, if they secured to him his allotted province. Now Pompey did all this from an unbounded love of power. But to that ancient infirmity of Crassus, his avarice, there was now added a fresh and ardent passion, in view of the glorious exploits of Caesar, for trophies and triumphs. In these alone he thought himself inferior to Caesar, but superior in everything else. And his passion gave him no rest nor peace till it ended in an inglorious death and public calamities. For when Caesar came down to the city of Lucca from Gaul, many Romans came thither to meet him, and among them Pompey and Crassus. They held private conferences with Caesar, and the three determined to carry matters with a higher hand, and make themselves sole master of the state. Caesar was to remain in his command, while Pompey and Crassus were to take over provinces and armies. But the only way to secure this end was by soliciting a second consulship. Since Pompey and Crassus were the candidates for this, Caesar was to cooperate with them by writing letters to his friends and by sending many of his soldiers home to support them at the elections. With this understanding, Crassus and Pompey returned to Rome, and were at once objects of suspicion. Report was rife through the whole city that their meeting with Caesar had been for no good purpose. In the Senate also, when Marcellinus and Domitius asked Pompey if he was going to be a candidate for the consulship, he replied that perhaps he was, and perhaps he was not. And when asked the question again, he said he should solicit the votes of the good citizens, and not those of the bad. Since his answers were thought to have been made in pride and arrogance, Crassus said, more modestly, when the question was put to him, that if it was for the interest of the city, he would be a candidate for the office, but otherwise he would desist. For this reason, divers persons were emboldened to sue for the consulship, one of whom was Domitius. When, however, Pompey and Crassus openly announced their candidature, the rest took fright and withdrew from the contest. But Cato encouraged Domitius, who was a kinsman and friend of his, to proceed, arguing and inciting him to cling to his hopes, assured that he would do battle for the common freedom. For it was not the candidature, he said, which Crassus and Pompey wanted, but a tyranny, nor did their course of action mean simply a canvass for office, but rather a seizure of provinces and armies. With such words and such sentiments, Cato all but forced Domitius to go to the forum as a candidate, and many joined their party. Many, too, voiced their amazement thus: "Why, pray, should these men want a second consulship? And why once more together? Have they not other colleagues? Surely there are many men among us who are not unworthy to be colleagues of Pompey and Crassus." Alarmed at this, the partisans of Crassus and Pompey abstained from no disorder or violence, however extreme, and capped the climax by waylaying Domitius as he was coming down into the forum before daybreak with his followers, killing his torchbearer and wounding many, among whom was Cato. After routing their opponents and shutting them up at home, they had themselves proclaimed consuls, and a short time afterwards they once more surrounded the rostra with armed men, and cast Cato out of the forum, slew several who made resistance, and then had another 5 years added to the proconsulship of Caesar in Gaul, and the provinces of Syria and both Spains voted to themselves. When the lot was cast, Syria fell to Crassus, and the Spains to Pompey. Now the lot fell out to the satisfaction of everybody, for most of the people wished Pompey to be not far away from the city. Pompey, who was passionately fond of his wife, intended to spend most of his time there, and as for Crassus, as soon as the lot fell out, he showed by his joy that he regarded no piece of good fortune in his whole life as more radiant than the one which had now come to him. Among strangers and in public he could scarcely hold his peace, while to his intimates he made many empty and youthful boasts, which ill became his years and disposition, for he had been anything but boastful or bombastic before this. But now, being altogether exalted and out of his senses, he would not consider Syria or even Parthia as the boundaries of his success, but thought to make the campaigns of Lucullus against Tigranes, and those of Pompey against Mithridates, seem mere child's play, and flew on the wings of his hopes as far as Bactria and India and the outer sea. And yet, in the decree which was passed regarding his mission, there was no mention of a Parthian war. But everyone knew that Crassus was all eagerness for this, and Caesar wrote to him from Gaul approving of his project and inciting him on to the war. And when Aetius, one of the tribunes of the people, threatened to oppose his leaving the city, and a large party arose which was displeased that anyone should go out to wage war on men who had done the state no wrong, but were in treaty relations with it, then Crassus, in fear, begged Pompey to come to his aid and join in escorting him out of the city. For great was Pompey's reputation with the crowd. And now, when the multitude, drawn up to resist the passage of Crassus and to abuse him, saw Pompey's beaming countenance in front of him, they were mollified and gave way before them in silence. But Aetius, upon meeting Crassus, at first tried to stop him with words, and protested against his advance, and then he bade his attendant seize the person of Crassus and detain him. And when the other tribune would not permit this, the attendant released Crassus, but Aetius ran on ahead to the city gate, placed there a blazing brazier, and when Crassus came up, cast incense and libations upon it, and invoked curses which were dreadful and terrifying in themselves, and were reinforced by sundry strange and dreadful gods, whom he summoned and called by name. The Romans say that these mysterious and ancient curses have such power that no one involved in them ever escapes, and misfortune falls also upon the one that utters them, wherefore they are not employed at random, nor by many. And accordingly at this time they find fault with Aetius, because it was for the city's sake that he was angered at Crassus, and yet he had involved the city in curses which awakened much superstitious terror. But Crassus came to Brundisium, and though the sea was still rough with wintry storms, he would not wait, but put out, and so lost a great number of his vessels. With what was left of his forces, however, he hurried on by land through Galatia, and finding that King Deiotarus, who was now a very old man, was founding a new city, he called on him, saying, "O king, you are beginning to build at the 12th hour." The Galatian laughed and said, "But you yourself, Imperator, as I see, are not marching very early in the day against the Parthians." Now Crassus was 60 years old, and over he looked older than his years. On his arrival things went at first as he had hoped, for he easily bridged the Euphrates, and led his army across in safety, and took possession of many cities in Mesopotamia, which came over to him on their own accord. But at one of them, of which Apollonius was tyrant, 100 of his soldiers were slain, whereupon he led up his forces against it, mastered it, plundered its property, and sold its inhabitants into slavery. The city was called Zenodotia by the Greeks. For its capture he allowed his soldiers to salute him as Imperator, therefore incurring much disgrace, and showing himself of a paltry spirit and without good hope for the greater struggles which lay before them, since he was so delighted with a trifling acquisition. After furnishing the cities which had come over to his side with garrisons, which amounted in all to 7,000 men at arms and 1,000 horsemen, he himself withdrew to take up winter quarters in Syria, and await there his son, who was coming from Caesar in Gaul, decorated with the insignias of his deeds of valor, and leading 1,000 picked horsemen. This was thought to be the first blunder which Crassus committed, after the expedition itself, which was the greatest of all his blunders, because when he should have advanced and come into touch with Babylon and Seleucia, cities always hostile to the Parthians, he gave his enemies time for preparation. Then, again, fault was found with him, because his sojourn into Syria was devoted to mercenary rather than military purposes. For he made no estimate of the number of his troops, and instituted no athletic contests for them, but reckoned upon the revenues of the cities, and spent many days weighing exactly the treasures of the goddess in Hierapolis, and prescribed quotas of soldiers for districts and dynasts to furnish, only to remit the prescription when money was offered him, thereby losing their respect and winning their contempt. after the first warning sign came to him from this very goddess, whom some call Venus, others Juno, while others still regard her as the national cause which supplies from moisture the beginnings and seeds of everything, and points out to mankind the source of all blessings. For as they were leaving her temple, first the youthful Crassus stumbled and fell at the gate, and then his father fell over him. No sooner had he begun to assemble his forces from their winter quarters than envoys came to him from Araxes with a wonderfully brief message. They said that if the army had been sent out by the Roman people, it meant war without truce and without treaty. But if this was against the wishes of his country, as they were informed, and for his own private gain that Crassus had come up in arms against the Parthians and occupied their territory, then Araxes would act with moderation, and would take pity on the old age of Crassus, and release to the Romans the men whom he had under watch and ward, rather than watching over him. To this Crassus boastfully replied that he would give his answer in Seleucia, whereupon the eldest of his envoys, Vagaces, burst out laughing, and said, pointing to the palm of his upturned hand, "O Crassus, hair will grow there before thou shalt see Seleucia." The embassy accordingly rode away to King Hierodes to tell him that there must be war. But from the cities in Mesopotamia, in which the Romans had garrisons, certain men made their escape at great hazard, and brought tidings of serious import. They had been eyewitnesses both of the numbers of the enemy and of their mode of warfare when they attacked the cities, and, as is usual, they exaggerated all the terrors of their report. When the men pursued, they declared, there was no escaping them, and when they fled there was no taking them, and strange missiles are the precursors of their appearance, which pierce through every obstacle before one sees who sent them. And as for the armor of their mail-clad horsemen, some of it is made to force its way through everything, and some of it to give way to nothing. When the soldiers heard this, their courage ebbed away, for they had been fully persuaded that the Parthians were not different at all from the Armenians, or even the Cappadocians, whom Lucullus had robbed and plundered till he was weary of it, and they had thought that the most difficult part of the war would be the long journey and the pursuit of men who would not come to close quarters. But now, contrary to their hopes, they were led to expect a struggle and great peril. Therefore some of the officers thought that Crassus ought to call a halt and reconsider the whole undertaking. Among these was Cassius the quaestor. The seers also quietly let it become known that the omens for Crassus which came from their sacrifices were always bad and inauspicious. But Crassus paid no heed to them, nor to those who advised anything else except to press forward. And most of all, Artabazes, the king of Armenia, gave him courage, for he came to his camp with 6,000 horsemen. They were said to be the king's guards and couriers, but he promised 10,000 mail-clad horsemen besides, and 30,000 footmen, to be maintained at his own cost. And he tried to persuade Crassus to invade Parthia by way of Armenia, for thus he would not only lead his forces along in the midst of plenty, which the king himself would provide, but would also proceed with safety, confronting the cavalry of the Parthians, in which lay their sole strength, with many mountains and continuous crests, and regions where the horse would not well serve. Crassus was tolerably well pleased with the king's zeal and the splendid reinforcements which he offered, but said he should march through Mesopotamia, where he had left many brave Romans. Upon this the Armenian rode away. Now as Crassus was taking his army across the Euphrates at Zeugma, many extraordinary peals of thunder crashed about them, and many flashes of lightning also darted in their faces, and a wind, half mist and half hurricane, fell upon their raft, breaking it up and shattering it in many places. The place where he was intending to encamp was also smitten by 2 thunderbolts, and one of the general's horses, richly caparisoned, violently dragged its groom along with it into the river and disappeared beneath the waves. It was said also that the first eagle which was raised aloft faced about of its own accord. Because all of this, it happened that when their rations were distributed to the soldiers after the crossing of the river, lentils and salt came first, which were held by the Romans to be the tokens of mourning, and are also set out as offerings to the dead. Moreover, Crassus himself, while haranguing his men, let fall a phrase which terribly confounded them. He said, namely, that he should destroy the bridge over the river, that not one of them might return. And although he ought, as soon as he perceived the strangeness of his expression, to have recalled it and made his meaning clear to his timorous hearers, he was too obstinate to do so. And finally, when he was making the customary sacrifice of purification for the army, and the seer placed the viziers in his hands, he let them fall to the ground. Then, seeing that the bystanders were beyond measure distressed at the occurrence, he smiled and said, "Such is old age, but no weapons, you may be sure, shall fall from its hands." After this he marched along the river with 7 legions of men-at-arms, nearly 4,000 horsemen, and about as many light-armed troops. Some of his scouts now came back from their explorations, and reported that the country was destitute of men, but that they had come upon the tracks of many horses, which had apparently wheeled about and fled from pursuit. Wherefore Crassus himself was all the more confident, and his soldiers went so far as to despise the Parthians utterly, believing that they should not come to close quarters. But nevertheless Cassius once more held a conference with Crassus, and advised him, above all things, to recuperate his forces in one of the garrisoned cities, until he should get some sure information about the enemy; but if not this, then to advance against Seleucia along the river. For in this way the transports would keep them abundantly supplied with provisions by putting in at their successive encampments, and by having the river to prevent their being surrounded, they would always fight their enemies on even terms and face to face. End of Marcus Licinius Crassus, Part 2.